Hello NRS123 teaching team. This is an experiment that I'm putting together to see if it works this session. If it doesn't, I won't worry about doing it again in the future. If it works really well, then I'll be suggesting that we look at doing it in other subjects as well. So let me know what you think about it when we get towards the end of session. What I want to do is provide you with 3 videos through the session that will provide a bit of guidance around what I've intended for the tutorials to happen, and part of the goal of this is to try to make sure that we're all working from the same page. And I mean, there's a certain amount of you know personalization that we put into our teaching, which is fine, and that we add our own anecdotes, and I mean, you've got to be flexible enough to allow your own teaching to come through to some extent. But I think we also need to be teaching from the same activities. We need to be doing the same learning, and it should be relatively easy for a student to move from one campus to another campus or to switch online and not really notice much of a difference in this subject. We'll be covering all the modules at the same pace on campus online. There's no rest school, so all of our students each week will be doing the same thing. I think it's helpful if we're trying to stay as consistent with each other as we can, keeping in mind that I have aligned the assessment items to the learning activities that happen. So if you're making decisions like we don't need to worry about the last activity of that tutorial because we won't have time, that's a decision that may have an effect on your student cohort. That may be a very important activity to support one of the 2 written papers or the exam. So please discuss that with me if you're finding before you get to the session that there's activities that you think you won't have time for or you don't think will work. You need to contact me, please, and we can talk about how we might get around that. And one suggestion you might give your students is that at the very least they might go and watch that part online, because I'll be covering all the activities regardless of how much time it takes. That's perhaps one solution, but let's look through the manual together. So that the TUTE manual is available on the Learning and Content Activities section of our i2 site. So there's the TUTE manual as the first option there. And then I've got it as a picture here, and you can click on the image and that will give you a PDF version of the tutorial manual. I'll just make it a bit smaller. So this is actually bigger is probably better. This is a TUTE manual. You've got room for the students to write their name on the front, which is good. You might suggest that they do that in the first week, so that if it goes missing, you can return it. You might even put their email address on it, would be a good thing to do as well. This is a document that's got tabs on the contents page, so if you click on week 1 it'll take you to week 1. That's a handy feature to point out to the students. My idea of this is that students will bring their laptops to class and they will have a printed out version of the document, and the reason that this isn't just a editable document that they can just put stuff in is because I don't think they'll read it properly. They won't go through the content and really absorb it all that well if they're just copying and pasting from one document to another one. My goal is that they'll have this printed out, they'll be writing in their manual, but they might also have a version of it up on their computers as well to take them to the links and all that sort of stuff. So there's method to the madness. Each week, if they open it up to the first couple of pages, they'll be able to click on the link and take them down to the week that they're going to be doing. So particularly given the size of this document, that's a useful feature to point out to the students at the start. So we've got your details in there. Thank you for reviewing the document. I've added everyone into the document. Now each week has preparation checklists for the tutorial, and part of that's about holding the students to be accountable for their own learning. This subject, or really all our subjects, but this one in particular, is built around the concept of flipped classrooms, where students have done some work before they've come along, that they've understood the basic theory behind what they're doing before they try to apply it to a practical or to a group discussion. They're not going to be able to contribute particularly well if they've never read any of this stuff. So rather than just go, have you read the textbook, and they'll go, no, there's a checklist at the start that they really should be doing before they come to each tutorial. So point that out to them and hold them to account, and tell them that you're going to be expecting them each week to have read the book, to have watched the lecture. That Amanda's put a huge amount of effort into making brilliant lectures that are available online. So there's those to watch. There's other online activities that are also really good. And there's prescribed text or readings for each topic, so they need to be going through those before they come along each week. And some of the activities, the first thing up in the week is to go through what they've learnt about. So if they haven't done the pre-reading, they're not going to be able to participate in that stuff, and it will be really obvious to you and their peers that they haven't done it. There's a preamble which is important to read through at the start of each class, please, that puts the context around what we'll be covering for each week. So in this one, we're looking at a general overall understanding of what law is and how it affects nurses, which is what the first assessment is all about. So really this first 2-hour module completely sets them up to do assessment 1. If the student misses this week in the tutorials and they don't watch the tutorial online, they're really going to, well, they won't necessarily struggle, but they're a long way behind in assessment item 1 than what they would have been if they had done this. It really sets them up well to complete that first assessment item. And there's learning outcomes, learning objectives at the start of each that I'd like you to go through with the students, please, as well. So all that takes about 5 minutes to get started. And then activity 1 is, what does the law mean to you? So get your students into groups of 3 to 4, ask them why the law is important to nurses and why do you think nurses need to have an understanding of the law. You might pose them the question of, if a nurse was to break the law and didn't know about it, would that matter? Would it be like if they've been if there's been a report going against a nurse for breaching a particular thing, or a complaint's been made about the nurse and they were unaware of that rule, would that make a difference? So I usually talk to them about that as well, that being ignorant to laws doesn't mean that they don't apply to nurses. Give some examples from a clinical context of situations where laws would have a significant impact on the practice of a registered nurse, and really any nursing practice would have an effect by laws. But some good examples are things like medication administration, end of life care, consent for a procedure, withholding treatment, care of a person under a particular age, so care of children, care of a person with a mental illness. There are specific situations where the law really becomes a big impact on what the nurse is doing. So it'd be worth directing students towards or coming up with their own, but also suggesting some things that are common things that you might have had some examples yourself where you didn't want to do something in particular, but the law meant that you had to. Like you might talk about the impact that the Privacy Act had on a situation where you wanted to tell someone something. You had a relative calling from overseas and they desperately wanted to know something about their patient, but you couldn't tell them because of the Privacy Act, whatever. You can talk about the situations where the laws really become prominent in a nurse's mind. What laws and legislation directly inform our practice. So we want them to be able to think about the laws that we'll be talking about throughout the subject. So some good examples here are things like the Work Health Safety Act, the Privacy Act, the HRIP Act, the Health Records Information Privacy or Protection Act, I think it's called, the health regulation, the national law, the health whatever, it's written through the manual. It's got a really long name. The law that it's called the national law, the law that we use, that registered nurses are governed by. That's a pretty obviously important law. The Work Health Safety Act is important. The civil act that we'll be looking at, yeah, it'll come up later on. There's a list of 5 or 6 of them in particular. The Work Health Safety, the Privacy Act, the Crimes Act is important as well from the point of view of assault and battery. So have a look through the legislation that you think will directly affect it, and have a look through the rest of the tutorial manual, because we'll be going through other examples as well. This section I think is important to think about, because I think the subject is structured at the moment with a lot of focus on law and some focus on professional, and it's sort of there's not really, ethics has been left out of the subject in a fairly dramatic way. So I've tried to carefully introduce it in a way that doesn't cause too many problems, but in any situation there's a legal aspect, a professional aspect, and an ethical aspect. What we're after is, what are the standards or considerations that a person might have. So the legal aspects of a situation, is something legal or illegal? Is something breaching a particular law? You'd look at common law and legislation and the difference between those two and how those things affect nurses. So we've covered those things in the previous questions. Then there's the professional considerations, are things like the RN standards for practice, the code of conduct, the code of ethics, the state guidelines that you have on particular procedures, that you're following those, that your conduct is professional, and we decide whether something is correct or incorrect, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. So it's not about, something can still be legal but still be unprofessional. Something can still be professional to do but break the law, for example. So trying to distinguish those two things and show students that when you ask, is something a good thing to do, it's not just about is it morally okay or is it legal. Sometimes it's, yeah, it might be legal, but it's actually unprofessional. You know, for example, you might be a bit dismissive of someone's concerns, that there's probably not breaking a law, and it would be hard to prosecute someone for being a bit rude to somebody, but it's definitely unprofessional, it's definitely unethical. And you can pull apart those scenarios where something can be one of those three things but not the others, and a lot of the time when we're looking at the really bad situations we'll be looking at in this subject, it will be all three. It will affect all of them. And then the ethical principles are justice, non-maleficence, beneficence, you know, fairness, justice. So I've talked about autonomy, those sort of principles that are built into the other two. All those principles are covered in the laws and professional standards, but they're a different idea. Being ethical or unethical is not necessarily an issue of whether it's legal or not. So they're usually intertwined and fairly messy and put all together, but it's worth pointing out to students that something can be legal and not be professional. Something can be professional but not legal. Well, not really. But anyway, those are different concepts. They're not the same thing. The next one is, what's the difference between common law and legislation? So you're going to point out one of them is about case law and the precedent cases that have come along before a particular case that's being looked at, and legislation is a process where laws have been put together through government organisations, either through local, state or federal government, have written legislation. So, and then it's voted on and decided and then signed off, and it's a bill that becomes a law and all those sort of things. All that's gone through in Staunton and Chiarella, so it's worth reading that and making sure students have done the same thing. Now, this is a case that we're going to look at 3 times through the tute manual. We're going to go through it 3 times through the session. It's about a guy that fed dishwashing detergent to a patient. It administered a dishwashing detergent in a medicine cup, thinking that it was a heart medication. And we'll look at the details of that later on. But first of all, we're just throwing out this case to go, the things we've just talked about, how do laws and professionalism and ethics affect a situation? How does it affect the nurse? This is a good example. This is a nurse that's done something that is unethical, unprofessional and illegal, and the impact that that's had on his career and the patient. So we'll be coming back to it and looking at it from different angles later on. You don't need to get a huge amount of detail into it, but it's a great case to open up the first week and go, right, this is a situation that nurses get themselves in, or even you might think, oh, I'd never do that, but you might be working in an environment where someone like this works, and that's a situation that could potentially be something that they might come across. So we talk about the context that we put, the context of doing this subject at all, by looking at this case and going, well, this is the sort of stuff that happens. So the question is, identify the factors that led to this nurse having his registration cancelled, which it talks about in the article, and then what do you think was the most serious aspect of the conduct behaviour? Hopefully students will come to the conclusion that the error he made was ridiculous and pretty scary, but the much worse thing that he did was pretend it didn't happen. He ignored that it happened and tried to get on with his day. He didn't report it. He worked out the error himself. He didn't tell anybody else, and that was a significant breach. And it was much worse than the initial error in the first place, I would argue. So hopefully you can have a bit of a debate about that if you like, but the point is that they need to consider that there's the error that he made, and then there's also a big part of the law, ethics and professionalism with nursing is around what you do once you've made a mistake rather than the mistake itself. So then there's medication error scenario. So then if we have a look at the, it's embedded into the I2 site. So if you open up the module in module 1 and have a look at that, it talks about a nurse inappropriately handling and administering medication to a patient. If you have a look at the STAR reading, we'll quickly open that up. Module 1. So the star reading here is medication error. Could this be a crime? You click on that one. And I've intentionally left it like that rather than building in a link or opening it up for them or having a little snippet of it or whatever. I want the students to make sure that in week one they know how to get into the modules and use them. So make sure that they're opening up with their laptops and opening up the module and finding this article rather than please don't download it and email it to them or anything, which is an issue with the copyright anyway, but it's important that they work out how to be able to open the article, which I'm struggling with myself at the second. Full text. So open this one up, have a bit of a read about it, and it talks about an error that the nurse made. And so yeah, read through that and then answer the questions as the group. Summarise what the nurse did wrong, what she was charged with, and then why the conviction was quashed. It talks about it in the end of that article. So that's a fairly straightforward, brief thing. The main part of that, as I mentioned, is for them to demonstrate that they know how to use the i2 site. They can get in and open it, and they can find the resources that we're giving them, because there's a lot of different stuff. There's a lot of great activities that have been put into the modules that we need to check the students know how to use. And then activity 4, it's important that you leave plenty of time for this. The first time I ran this tute, I actually ran out of time for this last activity because I got hung up talking with the other questions. But it's important that you get to this one. This is probably the most important aspect, I would say, of this tutorial. So make sure you've left enough time to talk about the difference between a civil case and a criminal case. So again, it's embedded in the module in the same page as the previous activity. And this was a nurse that murdered 2 people with insulin. And the answer is, why is this clearly a crime? Is because the nurse had an intention to do it. She killed 2 people on the same day. You can't really argue that it was inadvertent or that it was that it was an accident. The difference between a crime and a civil case was that you need to show intent or reckless disregard is the term that's used, and there was intent or reckless disregard in this situation. It's very clear that she's murdered 2 people on the same day, so it was a crime, and she's gone to prison as well. She should. So then we're going to pull apart. It's a fairly shocking case. It's worth sort of looking at early in the piece again to establish the context of what we'll be talking about in the subject, but it also helps you to sort of fray out the next few questions. So differentiate between the terminology used in a criminal and a civil case. So you can talk about the difference between prosecution and the complainant and defendant, so that they're different terms used across criminal and civil. You can talk about the suit that's brought across. Is the person charged, or is the person complaining about the suit? You go through that particular chapter and pull out all the different terminology. It does explain it quite well, and you should end up with a list of terminology that's only really used in criminal and a list that's used in civil. And then what's the standard of proof of a criminal versus a civil case? So for a criminal case, the phrase used is beyond reasonable doubt, which is an important concept that you need to explain to the students and get them to explain to you from reading the textbook, and make sure they understand what beyond reasonable doubt means. And then civil is balance of probability, so they need to be able to explain the balance of probabilities. And there's some useful videos. I think there's a video on the online module which is quite interesting that explains that concept. So they need to be able to explain the difference between the two. And then what is the purpose of the action in a criminal versus a civil case? So why do we bother having criminal cases, and why do we have civil cases? So criminal cases are around punishing someone. It's about the community's ability to defend itself against actions that are illegal. It's about establishing a reason for other people to not want to do that particular behaviour, so for the person themselves, but also for other people to observe and go, I wouldn't want to do that because I don't want the punishment to happen to me. And then civil cases, it's about giving people a non-violent way of working out their wrongdoings. So rather than getting revenge on someone, it's about adjusting a wrong that's happened to somebody from somebody else, and seeking compensation for that wrong. So that's the purpose of the two, and they trying to mix them up and trying to expect that one case will necessarily lead to the other is not the case. So understanding why those two different types of cases happen is important. And there's a checklist at the end of each module as well, watching the online lecture for the week. Again, this is similar to the stuff that you've got at the start of the next week, but just reminds them to go off and do that. There's also a few extra things I've thrown in, so read the subject outline more than once with a highlighter and get started on assessment 1. It's due in week 4. So there's things to prod them along, give them a bit of a nudge for particular activities that'll be upcoming in the next week or two. That's part of the purpose of the little checklist at the end. So week 2, we're looking at professional regulation of nursing, preparing for the TUTE. We've got the same stuff there. We've also got another preamble. And this one talks about the RN standards, the code of conduct, and being familiar with the things that regulate registered nurses in Australia. So the first activity asks them to go to the NMBA website and to think about a few things. So why do I need to be registered as a student? That question's answered directly on the site. What is the NMBA's role in relation to the student registration? It answers that directly on the site. So it's to show them what the NMBA is, because they may never have heard of it before, and talk to them about what the purpose of the NMBA is, what it does. So there's room there, a bit of time to discuss the concept of what the organisation is and what the board can do. Then activity 2 is locating and understanding legal cases. So this is where we're going to teach them how to go and find a case. And we're going to use several different cases and pull them apart and look at important aspects of them. It's also about teaching them how to dive into a case and get the important parts of it that they need, rather than reading 40 pages of stuff. So there are particular parts of the case when you get familiar with it, particularly through Austerly or the case law site, which I've got a couple of links to in a moment. But using that website and trying to get to the parts that you need of the story can speed that up a lot and make it easier for them to sift through them when they need to later. So from your readings, you should understand a major function of the NMBA is protection of the public. So this is a good point to talk about the difference between the HCCC and the NMBA, and what the role of the HCCC is, and how they bring nurses for professional misconduct cases. So locating and understanding the case, we asked them to look up HCCC v Cook 2012. So they'll go find that and describe their search process. They'll almost certainly throw it into Google, and then it'll talk to them about either Austerly, which is a good website. I'll just pop this up so you can see it, the spelling of it, when Word feels like opening for me. So Austerly is AUSTLII. Is a good website to go to, and that would also help them find it too. That helps them. I mean, Google will show them the answer, but Austerly is a good site. Also, Case Law Link, I think it's called, is New South Wales law, but either way, they'll find, if they put in the search thing through a regular internet search, they'll find it. What does HCCC and the New South Wales Nurses and Midwifery Professional Standards Committee, I think it is. It's a pretty impressive acronym. So they need to write those out, which they'll find when they open up the case. Who's the complainant and who is the respondent? So it's good for them to be able to establish the difference between those terms. In a paragraph, summarise which legislation the complaint was made and what the nurse was charged with. So that'll be built into the case as well if you have a look at that. What were the committee orders? So if you scroll down to committee orders down the bottom, that's where that is. How long did the interaction between the patient and the nurse last, and why is this important or interesting? I find this part about this case particularly fascinating because it's 20 seconds or 25 seconds or 30 seconds or something. It's not more than a minute. There's CCTV footage in this case where the nurse walks up to the triage bay and talks to the patient. They have a bit of a scuffle and the patient leaves, not getting assessed. She's quite towards the end of her pregnancy. She's a late stage pregnancy. She's got unknown pain that hasn't been assessed or done anything with, and the nurse sends her home and says, come back tomorrow. And everything that unfolds from what that little conversation meant was quite big, but the whole case is based around a 20-second interaction between a nurse and a patient, which I find amazing, because when I reflect on different difficult situations I've got myself through, and you will have had the same, that have gone on for ages, whatever. It can take as little as less than a minute that you could be talking to the patient before you're in front of a tribunal explaining yourself, which I think is an important point to ram home for the students, that this isn't necessarily a situation that you can see unfolding at the time, that you can go through. It's not a limit of, well, you weren't caring for that patient, therefore it's not your responsibility. Excuse me. That this is a situation where the person had never met the patient before, had nothing to do with them. They were immediately given a duty of care because the patient came into the ED, and they were there for 20 seconds and left again. And I don't know the full interaction, like it doesn't have a full transcript of what was said, but you know, in such a short space of time, the nurse can end up in so much trouble afterwards, I think is really important, and says a lot about, there's no length of time or no amount of, I wasn't really caring for that patient, that's going to get you out of this sort of conversation, because this case was incredibly short. So I'd point that out. It talks about in the case that the CCTV footage measures it for only being about 20 or 30 seconds. Good, so that's that activity. Then the activity 3 is professional boundaries in nursing. So there's a good document which is hard to find. I had to go and find it in a special different spot from where it used to be. But this document talks about a nurse's guide to professional boundaries. So it's hard to find online if you just go searching for it. But I found it and stuck it in there. And it's got an important area here around the continuum being involved in a patient, so that you can be a therapeutic relationship being in that helpful zone, and you can be less interested in the patient or being under involved, which is neglectful and disinterested and not caring about your patient, and then you can be too involved and you have boundary issues on the other side. I think that's a really helpful image to show the students, and then it's helpful if they read through these guidelines, the guiding principles. I think these have actually been sort of rescinded and not really being used just because I don't know why, but they're excellent to read. Important for the students to have a bit of a think about what is professional and what's not, and where the boundaries are. I find this a bit complicated reading through the decision-making tool. I think the principles are probably a bit easier, but they've also got some other scenarios. But from reading this page here, this is the most important page here with the guiding principles. If they read through that, that will help them answer the questions. So in the scenario, you've got an elderly woman who knows that you're a nurse. The lady has an operation that involves a colostomy when at home. The lady decides one evening that she needs a shower. It's 1 a.m. in the morning. She decides that in order to shower, she needs to completely take down the colostomy, which is probably not true. Her son, who lives with her, panics and knocks on the door and asks you to reapply the colostomy. So, you know, each story goes through with these different boundary issues. So the area of concern is really around, you know, I would say the privacy of the nurse, that you'd feel obliged personally to go and help, but you know, you're actually not. You're off duty and you have the right to be at home at 1 o'clock in the morning without responding to a health situation. So there are boundaries there that you might establish with the next door neighbour beforehand around, yeah, I'm a nurse, but you know, if you need help and it's urgent, then you really need to go to the hospital for stuff like that. So really around, can the nurse be legally, professionally or ethically required to do anything? Excuse me. And then there's a difference between required and then able to help. So you might have a decision. You might decide you'd be very happy to go and do those things. Then there's a legal, ethical, professional issue around, are you allowed to do those things? It's a different question to, is the nurse obligated to go and help, compared to, is the nurse permitted to go and help? Because I would say, yeah, they are permitted, especially if they've been, you know, welcomed into the house and they've been, you know, that's been something someone's asked them to do. They'd be allowed to do that, and that wouldn't be unethical. But if a nurse was to overhear that that's what was going on and the patient hadn't actually said anything, it would be a breach of their privacy and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, I think it's a difficult area to traverse because of the it's probably permissible for the nurse to get involved if they want to, but there's an element of professional boundary issues here because the patient is using the fact that she knows the patient, that the next door neighbour is a registered nurse, to help out when that's not really her role at the moment. She's not a you know, ED nurse that happens to be on duty at the moment. She's a, you know, a person sleeping at home. So you can talk to them about your right to be off the clock and to not be at work, I think. So what should you do is involves interesting discussions around, do you have to help? Would you like to help? Would you be permitted to help? All those sort of things. Scenario 2 is working on a medical ward looking after a female patient who's having a diabetes monitored. At the end of the rostered days, you're giving handover and about to go off duty, and she asks to see you. She's got an envelope with the name on it and talks about go buy something nice for yourself. The guidelines specifically talk about being able to accept gifts of a particular value, and we normally talk about how we generally try to accept things on behalf of the department rather than on an individual. So if you've been giving great care, that's fine, but I'm representative of a group of people. So, if someone's trying to give you a box of chocolates, you might say, is it okay if I accept these on behalf of the ward and share them around? And we normally talk about the limit, which I think is about $20 or $25. I think it's in the professional document about how much is acceptable to accept without then reporting it. If you're given a significant donation, obviously you talk to them about there's a process to how that's received by the hospital, and it's not an individual nurse that says, yep, thanks for that, and takes it home, that becomes a donation to the health service, and how that's managed. So that's what they do about that situation. Then scenario 3, you're a female registered nurse working on an orthopaedic ward, and one of your patients is a male who has suffered a leg injury sustained following a motorbike accident. You develop a friendly relationship with the patient, and he says if he can have your phone number once he goes home. So she's surprised and flattered. I'm not sure that you could guarantee the student would be surprised and flattered, but there you go. So identify the main area of concern, and again, the guidelines talk about having romantic relationships or not having romantic relationships, and the main issue around how you can coexist in a relationship where you are the caregiver, as opposed to a prospective love interest, that you can't really coexist with both of those things going on properly, to be able to effectively give care to the person, to be able to not be biased against other patients. So if you particularly like this fella, and he's on the ward and you're really attracted to him, that you may end up in his room more often than other people's rooms, and it just has a lot of different ethical and professional issues around it. So we mainly talked about probably this isn't a brilliant way to start a relationship, and that certainly you wouldn't be able to start a relationship while he was under your care as a patient, but it gets a lot ethically trickier and murkier afterwards, I think, where if he's no longer a patient afterwards and you bump into him some other way, I don't know, I'm sure other relationships have started that way, but yeah, tricky. The guideline talks about fairly clear around not doing things while and how it is professional misconduct to be getting involved emotionally, physically, whatever, with a patient while they're still under your care. Again, there's a checklist for the following week. The next week is consent. So this is week 3. It's consent's really important topic to get right. Well, they're all important topics to get right, but this is one that I think is only really covered particularly well in this subject, and it's sort of alluded to in other subjects. So it talks about why consent is important around avoiding trespass and assault and battery, and negligence as well. So the way those are interacted is in that quote. And then we go through the learning outcomes. I've included in this week a bit of a summary of the key points to help sort of get the students across the key. There are key parts that'll definitely be in the assessment items. For example, the exam, I wouldn't tell them this necessarily specifically like this, but questions like this will be in the exam almost verbatim, that they'll be asked about what the 3 elements of consent are in a multiple choice question or in a short answer question. They'll be asked to apply it to a scenario and say, did that person have consent or not? If the consent wasn't gained effectively in this scenario, why not? And it'll be because they didn't have one of these elements correct. So they'll need to have a fairly good working understanding of these 2 things that are coming up. So the first point is, what are the for a valid consent, it needs to have 3 elements, and the students really get confused between the 3 types of consent and the 3 elements of consent. It's frustrating that there's 3 of both, but it's important to separate those out because they'll get mixed up. So, and you'll ask them through the session, and again, what are the three elements of consent? And they'll try to tell you, it's verbal, and no, hang on, that they tend to mix it up. So, for consent to be valid, the patient must be informed of the risk and benefits. So, the patient has to be informed consent. The second thing is that it needs to be not coerced. It can't be something that the person was forced to do, and it can't be something that they were blackmailed into. You can't say you must have this procedure or we'll send you home. It needs to be a given freely, so uncoerced. And then the final thing is the person has to have capacity to give consent. So that's where you talk about a child or a person with mental illness or a person that's unconscious. If a person who doesn't have capacity cognitively or mentally to be able to consent to a particular procedure, then they can't consent either. And that's one of the more trickier ones to explain because that changes over time. A person can sort of come in and out of consciousness or whatever, and their level of capacity to consent to things and what they can consent to is different. Particularly in New South Wales, it talks about of age groups that there's teenagers that can consent to some procedures but not others depending on what's going on. So it gets really a bit tricky around what capacity means, but needs to be informed consent, needs to be uncoerced, and needs to be the person needs to have capacity. You want the students to be able to speak it out like that, so that if they need to practice it a few times, or you might make that a quiz that you give them the next week and say, "Now tell me what the three elements of consent are." It's good for them to be able to knock those things out in a conversation because certainly when it comes to the clinical subjects, we're going to want the students to be able to get consent in the practice that they're doing. And we're going to say, well, was it really consent? Because you said, I'm just going to do this procedure to you. Was that a valid consent? Have a think about what the elements are of consent. And then we want them to be able to see the relevance of that to clinical context. And we'll be practicing that in a moment. So that's the three elements. And then there's the three types of consent. I've given them the three types, so implied, verbal, and written. And then they need to give us some examples of the situations when you might want those particular procedures. So I've talked when I did it mainly about that written consent's pretty rare for nurses to get, that a written consent's a lot more common for invasive procedures or surgical procedures, basically where anything major might go wrong that you might be concerned about, blood transfusions and stuff like that. So nurses generally don't personally receive written consent from patients, but they may need to see written consent. So if you're doing a check-off list for a pre-op patient, or you're about to give blood products, you may need to see a written consent, but I haven't been in a situation where I have signed a consent form with a patient before. And the textbook talks about that in sort of there's differences in how a nurse might be involved in that and how you can sign a consent form as a witness to the patient signing it, but not that I'm getting the patient to consent to the procedure. So you can be a witness, and all you're saying in that particular situation is, I am stating that I have definitely seen this patient sign this piece of paper and it was the patient signing it. That's different to, I have discussed the risks and benefits of this procedure with the patient and they have said yes to me doing this procedure. Those two different signatures are very different, and I've taken the point to explain that with students in the written bit. Then you talk about when implied consent and verbal consent makes sense in nursing situations, and I guess it's a quite personal situation, but for me, anything that's invasive, I always get verbal consent. I wouldn't say I'm just going to stick a nasogastric tube down your throat and start doing it without the patient verbalising they were happy with it, unless they were intubated and stuff, I suppose. But that's the other thing we talk about, why implied consent might be necessary when you can't get verbal consent. Really, I think verbal consent is a preferable thing to get in most situations, but implied might be necessary if the person is unconscious or that they are sort of nodding along and saying, yeah, that's fine, for doing a blood pressure, for doing things that are non-invasive and don't hurt the person, then implied consent might be fine. So it's good to have a discussion about when each of those things might be helpful. And then there's some case scenarios where they go through with what is consent and what is not. So I'll let you read through those. I think they're fairly self-explanatory, but there's some different stories where those three elements of consent are sort of pushed and to try to work out, was it and you might even do that. I would actually apply that to these stories and say, what's the legal issue here involved? You might say, okay, was it a capacity issue or a coercion issue, or was it a capacity and risk, whether that was an informed issue. So you might even separate each of these cases and try to work out, is it one or more of each of these things? What legal repercussion could arise out of the RN's actions? Obviously, you're talking about the patient, the nurse becomes liable for assault, because she did something to the patient, assault and battery. She did things to the patient against his will. And what should the nurse, how should the nurse have acted towards Mr. Smith? So you can talk through the right course of action. Can Mr. Smith discharge himself in these circumstances? You can talk about capacity to make that decision, and what should the RN do now? Which is, given that, so it says, how should the RN have acted, sort of hypothetically, what would have been better if the nurse had have done it? But given that this is what's happened, this is the end of the scenario, what should the registered nurse do at this point? That's what that question's asking. So scenario 2 is about MVA with a guy who needs a blood sample, and it's about when consent is actually not necessary. So a person can be required to give a blood sample, and you can talk about how it's not really our role to hold the patient down and take the blood sample without consent, that it involves the police and possibly security or whoever to be able to get that sample, and that it's you can explain to the patient that it's breaking the law to refuse to give that blood sample, which is an issue for the police and the patient to sort out, but that it's not really an issue of, it's an interesting case because he's not allowed to say, no, I don't want that. He needs to give that blood sample. It's legally required. So that's an interesting point, and it's a good example of the previous, the first week where we talked about professional, legal and ethical standards, because ethically it breaches his autonomy to take blood from him when he really doesn't want it to. It's an ethically grey area because he really doesn't want this blood test done. It's going to hurt him. It's going to be invasive. And it's still legally required. So it's legal, and it's illegal not to do it. But it's unethical to cause harm, and the beneficence and non-maleficence and all that stuff. There's no benefit to this patient from his health point of view to taking blood from him. So it's a really interesting case of that, I think. So there's a couple of other stories where they go through other elements of the consent thing, and feel free to email me if you're not sure, and I can take you through those if you want me to. And then there's another one about a Jehovah's Witness patient, or a patient with a Jehovah's Witness mother who this one becomes about the age of consent, and if she's 15 and she lives in New South Wales, what difference will that make? And they go through, if they look up, age of consent, blah blah blah. There's a good website that talks about state by state what the limitations are on the age groups and what they can consent to. So that's that one. Then there's vulnerable groups and consent. So it talks about an older person, in particular, Mrs. I've forgotten her name. I'm sorry, but the RN was Susan Gillies, and the AIN with this quote is from AIN Boyton, and it's a story about a patient, because I think it's she's anonymous, but it's just very, very neglectful, very unpleasant care that wasn't, well, not care is not a good word, but really they assaulted her and were quite, the RN was quite unpleasant towards her. So the point of this story is to look at it from, was she able to consent? Did she actually consent to any of this stuff? And it sounds obvious, but asking them to apply those three pillars of the three elements of consent, and to talk about, did she consent to any of this? Was there parts of it that she actually did consent to? And to pull it apart from it sort of feeds into the next sort of couple of weeks around negligence and stuff as well. So what was wrong about the situation? Reflecting on the activity of from the first part, which elements of valid consent were missing? I'd say all three of them. What were the contributing factors to the situation occurring? So rather than saying, oh, that nurse is horrible, no one else would do that. That's just a one-off horrible psychopathic nurse. It's probably not. That it would be it doesn't make it okay to assault a person, but that there is an increased stress that happens when you look after confused older patients all the time. That affects people. That the RN may be overworked. That may be, and I'm not saying that's fine, therefore she gets to assault people, but there are other elements that build into how this situation happened, rather than a very pleasant nurse walked in and just acted completely absurdly. Like there would be other factors that have led to this person getting to this point. So what other factors might be affecting the RN? Has she just had a divorce? like yesterday, is she splitting up with her partner? Has she just had a death in the family? Like there are things that might be, has she changed their medications or something? Things that might make her behave in a particular way. And then I mean, from an organization point of view, this is perhaps not the first or last time this person has done something like this. What allows this to happen is, the people witnessing it not doing anything about it. This situation obviously got reported, brilliant, but there might have been 10 or 12 situations before that that weren't. So, did the organization allow this behavior to keep happening? Stuff like that. It's good to pull apart the situation, think about there's more to this than just one crazy nurse misbehaving. There's other elements that have fed into how this has eventuated, which is good to look at. The text in the extract is exactly as it was provided by the witness. What did you observe about the language? So as you read through it, it's quite illiterate, and there's a lot of misspelling, a lot of issues around how it's written. That's good to talk about in the sense that you'll have students in your group that'll struggle with writing and spelling and all that stuff. You might mention to them that this is the sort of stuff that goes to a board and gets deciding as to whether people have behaved particularly well or not. That I wouldn't want my view of this event to read like this. This is quite concerning. So it's great that she's spoken up and that she's given quite a good account really of what happened. But that writing in a way that is coherent is important, and particularly for situations where you're trying to explain a situation like this one, that they need to develop a professional way of communicating, because their information might not just be the next shift, it might be information that's used in this sort of hearing. So I think that's important to point out as well. And then so yeah, that's that bit. Then perhaps the most important part of this week is, other than reporting the event to a manager, what would the AIN have been obliged to do in this situation, do you think? Note that this question is particularly relevant to one of the questions in assessment on 2. So almost verbatim, this is what the question is. It talks about what is a witness obligated to do, and beyond reporting it. Because last year we had a similar question, and 2/3 of the students wrote, "I'd report it." And that was pretty much their response. They talk about how important it was to report it, and reporting it's really, really very important. And that's good, but there's more to it than that. That the AIN probably would have been obliged to administer first aid to make sure that the RN wasn't in the room with the patient, to try to get the RN away from the patient as quick as possible. There'll be other obligation the person has in terms of first do no harm and all that other stuff around, did the patient need some sort of counselling afterwards? Did the AIN suggest to the NUM, like the RN wasn't in her right mind, she might need some sort of counselling? Like, there'd be obligations of a registered nurse in this situation. This is an AIN, but of a witness of an event like this, rather than just say, "I've told my boss I'm done," to follow up and do a bit more than that, and to at least administer first aid, to think about counselling for whoever's involved, to think about her own counselling as well. That you'd be obliged to be thinking about self-care and thinking about how much have I been affected by all that sort of stuff. So that's one of the questions in their assignments. It's really helpful to go through that in a much bigger way than, make sure you report it when this stuff happens. You need to report that there was a bit of a water spill and you've mopped it up. That's a report. This is a report, but it's a lot of other things as well. It's a lot more complex than just report it. So I think it's an important point to punch out that there are other elements to this, more important things than just "I'd report it." And you are talking to a lot of students. Most of them haven't done any clinical experience at all. They're about to go out on 122 placement, a lot of them. But at this stage in the session, a lot of them have never done any workplace learning at all. A lot of them have no nursing backgrounds. You're talking to people that have no idea about all this stuff. So you'll need to explain the role of a nurse in a situation like that. You might even suggest, it'd be a really good point to suggest, look, so suppose it's not a nurse. Suppose it's just a regular person that saw someone treating their mum like this in a supermarket. What would you be obligated to do? Like, wouldn't you feel the need to step in and say something? Like, that we could talk about, you're making sure you stay safe yourself and putting yourself in the right place in the room, and trying to de-escalate the situation and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of things that could be done that are not just report it. So that's what that question's all about. Again, there's a checklist, and this brings us to the end of week 3. This went for much longer than I meant it to, so thank you for staying in if you have until this point. I'll try to make the next 2 videos much shorter. Thanks, guys.